Hi all, I'd like to present an idea today for your own chess thinking, if you play it online or over the board, which you might not have considered before, and it's called SWOT Analysis. Strengths, Weaknesses, Opportunities and Threats is a nice acronym representing both the short-term and longer-term opportunities you might have. And I'm a big fan, you may have noticed, of weaknesses of the last move. So this heads off this list. What squares did the last move of the opponent no longer defend? So that's often what you can capitalize on, just in the weakness of the opponent's last move. A very, very big one, most frequent. What pieces are now liberated, which you can capitalize on? So sometimes your pieces are liberated by the opponent's last move. What parking spaces are now used up, which you can capitalize on? Sometimes, for example, they take out a parking space, which is essential, like a king exit square. What common squares are now available, which you can capitalize on? So when more than one of your pieces have now a central focus square, a common square, that's often very dangerous to make use of that. Often that's an infiltration, a key infiltration. So bear these four in mind. I won't return to that slide for the interest of keeping a nice game flow now. Let's have a look at this game example with this in the back of our mind, and I'll bring it out at key moments during this game. So this game was Alan Stig Ramussen against Mads Andersen, played in the Extracon Open 2019. So let's have a look. Both are very, very strong Danish players. Ramussen is a Grandmaster Danish champion in 2010, 2011, 2014. Mads Andersen is also a Grandmaster and is one of the top players in the country. Okay, so d4 from Ramussen, knight f6. We go into the Grunfeld defense. And so far, this is just standard opening theory. Bishop g7. If we applied here our template, nothing too significant is happening here. There's a basic weakness of e7 with that move. It weakened e7 as a sort of weakness of the last move. Don't just look at the last move arrow, look at what it weakens. Bishop g5. We're looking at black's point of view actually today. So bishop g5, c5. So this kind of, technically weakens b6 and d6. The special case of pawns, though, they don't go backwards. So if there was, say, a piece on b5 or d5, black loses the opportunity for playing c6 to nudge a piece here and here. So that's the more subtle downside of any pawn moves, and they can't be reversed. They're very, very committal decisions. So they are a very, very special case of weakness of the last move. Rook c1. We have now black castling, so you might consider, hold on a sec, isn't there a pawn here to be taken? If c takes d4, c takes, bishop takes d4, we have to calculate. Often in chess, rook takes c8 is devastating. So for example, if queen takes d4, and there's no problems for white winning material here, the bishop's covering c1, and so that's winning, and also it's winning here if bishop takes f2. We can just take here, the rook is pinning the queen, there's no queen takes d1, and here this is just material up for white, very, very nice. So that pawn is immune on d4. Black castles. Okay, we have d5, queen d6, so technically the queen going from d8 to d6, the kind of weakness of the last move would include a5. It's no longer got access to a5, but the other squares it still has access to, from either d8 or d6, and it's obviously got new opportunities as well, the queen, but it has technically, you could say, the weakness of the last move is that parking space used up is d6. It hasn't liberated any white pieces, and there's no extra common squares, it seems, that it's carried. Bishop e2, f5. Now this is interesting. It gives the technical weakness of the last move, e6 and g6, but again, pawns don't go backwards, so it's a very, very committal decision. If black wanted to ever play f6, that opportunity is lost to kick pieces from e5 and g5. Now, in terms of the broader O and T of SWOT, There is actually something here about the very, very dangerous diagonal. This is often the cause of losing games for black, this diagonal, weaken this diagonal fundamentally. The broader king safety issue is perhaps a more longer term thing to exploit. So that's the O and T have been exposed here a bit of this last move. So is there a longer term plan for that exploitation? But black seems to be totally activating the pieces. E takes, bishop takes. It looks absolutely glorious in many respects that these bishops seem really active. The rook seems active. What could possibly go wrong here? Knight f3. We have knight d7. White castles. And it looks as though after knight f6, this d pawn is also pretty uncomfortable. Does white have to play c4? First, very, very clever move here. Queen b3. And okay, is this diagonal and the king being on it sufficient that black can't really play knight takes d5? Black played knight e4 here. If we look at knight takes d5, it seems as though rook fd1 is very dangerous for black. For example, bishop e4, the key move is knight d2, and then knight c4, and and rook e1 with the threat of bishop f3 coming up. And this is very, very dangerous. White can at least get the material back with a big advantage in this position. So it's if e6 here instead, then c4, and this is just winning a winning position after d6. Even if black has that resource, this is much better for white. It turns out much better for white. So it is very, very tricky here. So after bishop e2, sorry, bishop e4, knight d2, that's good. If c4, you might be tempted, c4, black actually has a brilliant resource here, which maybe both players did calculate. Knight f4, offering the queen, knight takes e2 check, and e takes, and black actually gets a small edge. So fascinating variation there. But it's, yeah, if white plays the cards right after knight d2, then that's fine for white. So anyway, d5 was ignored, and we have knight e4. But if you remember the SWOT kind of template questions, so technically in the short term, the knight going to e4 has kind of weakened. When it was on f6, it's weakened g4 technically, these squares basically. It's no longer has influence on these squares if you look at when the knight was on f6. So the squares of influence lost include these squares when it was on f6. But something else has lit up suddenly with great effect on that template, and which is the pieces that have now been liberated for us. In fact, the knight was kind of blocking the bishop looking at e7. So in fact, this bishop is now liberated towards e7. And does this represent an opportunity or not? A major opportunity. In terms of common squares of two or more of white pieces, that doesn't exist here. Parking spaces, well, e4's used up. That's not something we can capitalize on right now. But can we capitalize on the liberation as angle of this move? So that's a kind of opportunity of the last move. So if I give you 5 seconds to pause the video, what would you play in this position? Okay, in fact, this SWOT analysis gives us a completely killer move in this position. Bishop takes e7. So the realms of forcing move calculation, obviously they're very, very important in chess to be able to calculate forcing moves. And this forcing move wrenches open now after queen takes e7. Otherwise black's just going to lose the exchange. And we have d6 check now. That's the point, opening up this attack on the diagonal. Now, if black plays bishop e6, d takes, and that pawn is hitting the rook. So this would be a winning position. Black's losing a ton of material there. So that's no good. So black actually, after d6, has horrible choices. Black played queen f7. Queen e6 is no better, because they're both going to run into, I hope you've spotted this, bishop c4. Now you can consider that the move d6 was actually the strengths part of SWOT, because it liberated our own pieces as well. But I like primarily to look at quite often the opponent's moves, to look at what you can capitalize on in the opponent's moves. But clearly this is the S of SWOT, the liberation d6, so very powerful on this diagonal, creating a battery now, winning the queen. And the game didn't last too long after this. After bishop takes, queen d5, knight e4, rook fe1, that was it. So I'm hoping that you might find this little game example interesting, that how suddenly this template, they're lurking, these questions are lurking. I'll just briefly recap. These are lurking questions which can suddenly spring up during a game as a major opportunity. So what squares did the last move no longer defend? What pieces of yours are now liberated, which you can now capitalize on? So that really sprung up that question when knight e4 was played, and then bishop takes e7. Parking spaces, this can sometimes spring up, if especially when you're trying to attack the king, a parking space and takes up an exit of the king. Common squares, this can sometimes spring up when you have two pieces now have a common square, so they can suddenly spring up during a game. So I hope you might find this interesting, and if you did, maybe we can check out some other perhaps more classic games with this model, this strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats model in mind. So let me know if you think it might be useful for your own games, if you want to try it out. It's something I do currently recommend to students to check out. And this game choice was actually inspired by this amazing course at Chessable, Pawns on the Attack, which is a free course to check out, 200 training positions, and a number of very fascinating games like this one, for how pawns often liberate pieces, set up checkmates or checkmate themselves. So Kingscrusher TV, Pawns on the Attack by Alan Bester, who has actually a number of other free courses as well to check out with the On the Attack theme. Okay. Thanks so much.